Hi everyone, my name is Steph, this is the Novelty Corner and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be recommending some First Nations titles across a variety of readership categories and genre categories as well, because we are coming up on the 26th of January, which is a very controversial day here in Australia. So it is the day known as Australia Day, but it is also the day that the British first arrived in Australia. And so that is a really pivotal but also a really incredibly distressing day in terms of colonisation of the country and the impact that it has had on our First Nations people. If you're in Australia, it is still fairly controversial. A lot of people like it because it's a public holiday, because everyone loves a public holiday, but it's also a day that causes great distress to our First Nations community. A lot of people might refer to it as Invasion Day or Survival Day. It's honestly not a day that I have celebrated, at least not in the last 10-15 years. As I've grown as an adult, I've learned more about Australian history, which I had to do as an adult because the schooling system when I went through didn't teach that, or it just taught the very white colonial version of history. So as an adult, it's not a day that I celebrate. And often the way that I choose to spend that day is by reading First Nations fiction or poetry or something to try and continue to broaden my understanding, to deepen my knowledge, and to understand more the implications of colonisation here in Australia. So today I'm going to be recommending a bunch of books, and then I'm also going to share with you the potential TBR that I have. So stick around to the end because I will show you, I think I've got about 4 books that I may potentially read around the 26th of January. So we're going to start out in the kids and YA readership category. So I have a few recommendations here. I should say these are not all the books that I've read, but these are the ones that I've grabbed off my shelf that I feel like I can just quickly throw some recommendations. These aren't going to be long, but they could be potentials if you're looking to pick up Australian First Nations fiction for yourself or for anyone in your life. I think it's really important for everyone around the world to read the stories by First Nations people from all around the world. I could have just brought out my entire picture book collection because I have spent a lot of time collecting and curating a First Nations picture book collection that I have available not just for myself and my family, but also for my classroom and for the students that I work with, because we do have First Nations students in our school and I will have First Nations students in my classroom. So I could do that, except it would be here forever. Starting out with sort of junior and middle fiction, there is Uncle Xbox by Jared Thomas, which is about the story of a boy who reconnects with his uncle and learns that there's more to life than just playing the Xbox, and through this he is able to connect with his family's culture. There is Nearer, Deep Time Traveler, The Broken Rainbow. This is by Tasma, Walton and Samantha Campbell, and this one is a middle grade fantasy story about Nearer, who is able to time travel using artifacts passed down from her grandmother. Through this she is able to connect with the legends of the dreaming. A very well-known book is Bindi by Kirli Saunders. This is a fantastic, phenomenal novel in verse, and it is about Bindi. She's 11 years old, and the year that she thought was going to be the best year ever isn't quite going to plan. There's injuries, there are massive bushfires, there's the regular coming of age kind of things that are happening, and it is a truly, truly wonderful tale. This is not the first time you're going to hear Kirli Saunders on this list. She features a few times because I absolutely adore her work. There is Sister Heart by Sally Morgan. Again, this is a novel in verse, and this explores the stolen generation and Annie, who is taken from her family, and how she makes her own new life in this strange world that she finds herself in. There is Catching Terra by Ambelin, Kwaymullina and Ezekiel Kwaymullina, which is one of my all-time favourite young adult First Nations books. This one is a really interesting one because it is both a novel and a novel in verse at the same time. And our main character, Beth, has died, and she is following her dad, who is a detective, and he can see and he can talk to her as they are investigating a mystery that involves Isabel catching and a man who died in a fire. It is an incredibly told story, and a high school teacher that I worked with last year let me know that he was reading it because it was potentially a book that was going to be added to their book list, and I just got so excited because the book is wonderful. There is Black Cockatoo and Dirrarn, which are both part of the same story. They follow Mia, who rescues a black cockatoo, which is her family's totem. And again, this explores coming of age. This kind of moves from the upper middle grade category into the younger YA category. And yeah, it explores all of those coming of age ideals. It's her connection to her family, to her culture. And then in Dirrarn, she is away at boarding school. And it's the same thing. It's how do you stay connected to your family and your culture when you are not with them? Beautiful books, very short, but very powerful. And then we have Gary Lonesborough, who has 3 young adult titles out. He writes queer young adult fiction. His first book was The Boy from the Mish, which explores first love. There is We Didn't Think It Through, which looks at First Nations children who end up going through the youth detention system. And then there is I'm Not Really Here, which looks at fitting in, finding yourself in a new place, learning how to make friends, but also falling in love. All right, then moving into some fiction. I do want to mention Dr. Anita Heiss writes incredible books as well. I've read a couple of her books, and I do have one that's sitting in the non-fiction category as well, but I don't have any physical copies. These are great. I also have a few more of hers that I would like to read. There is also The Visitors by Jane Harrison, which is the reimagining of the first interactions between the British and the First Nations people, and it centres around a group of Indigenous elders who are meeting to decide what to do when they start spotting these sails off the shores of what is now known as Sydney Harbour. It's a really interesting one, and I highly recommend the audiobook for it. The rest I have is speculative fiction. So there is Claire G. Coleman. She wrote Terra, Nullius, which was one of the first First Nation speculative fiction books that I ever read. And this one is a really interesting one to read and to talk about, because to kind of talk about it is to give away the story, but it does look at the colonisation of Australia, but it is not quite what you expect. This does sit firmly in speculative fiction, but I can highly recommend it, and anything that Claire G. Coleman has written. Then there are some anthologies. So there is Always Will Be by Mykaela Saunders. Mykaela Saunders writes incredible speculative fiction, and this is a collection of her work. And then there is This All Come Back Now. This one is a collection that is edited by Mykaela Saunders, but features lots of different authors. Again, a truly fantastic collection to explore with lots of different kinds of stories. And then a book that you will have seen me talk about in my Buzzwordathon reading vlog for January was Unlimited Futures. This is speculative, visionary, black and black fiction. So it's not just First Nations writers, but it does feature First Nations and the Afro-Black diaspora writers here in Australia. This is a collection edited by Rafif Ismail and Ellen Van Nerven, and is truly wonderful. There's lots of really interesting stories within this. Then one of my favourite things to read by First Nations authors are poetry collections. There is Living on Stolen Land by Ambelin Kwaymullina. This is a prose style manifesto about settler colonial present, and it's short, but it is incredibly powerful. There is She's the Earth by Ali Cobby Eckermann. Again, a really interesting collection. This one is more of a verse novel, but really engaging and again, very powerful. In fact, all of these are very powerful. Let's not just overuse that word. There is The Body Country by Susie Anderson, which I really enjoyed exploring because I had not read any Susie Anderson before I picked this up. And this one is more of a reflection on self and connection to country and to place. One that I found probably a little bit heavier because it is very much the poet's own experiences was More Than These Bones by B.B. Blackhouse. This one uses not only poetry but also photos and visuals to enhance the story that is being told, which is the story of the poet. Then we have two Kirli Saunders books. There is Returning, which was the first Kirli Saunders poetry book that I read. This one features full colour artwork, which is just stunning. And it's all been done by Kirli Saunders, so not just the poems but the art that accompanies it. There was so much to love in this one as Kirli Saunders rediscovers herself and her connection to country, and she's looking at ideas of decolonisation, her queerness and First Nations matriarchy. I love this one so much. It's great. I try and recommend that to as many people as I can. And then there is Kindred, which is also by Kirli Saunders. And again, this challenges us to reflect on ourselves, our connection to the places that we call home, to the connections that we have made with people, with our family. Just beautiful. And then there are three poetry collections that I have. So there is Bindi, Next Generation Black Writing. Now, this I probably could have included in fiction, but I included it in poetry because there is poetry in here. So there is poetry, there are stories, there are essays, etc. Really interesting collection. There is Firefront First Nations Poetry and Power Today. This is edited by Alison Whitaker, and it does feature not just poems but also essays. So each section starts off with an essay that sort of centralizes the poems that we're about to read, and then there's about 10 or so poems that sort of fit within that essay umbrella, and it's really wonderful. And there is Gwayo for All Times, a collection of First Nations poems. This was commissioned by Red Room Poetry and edited by Janine Leon, and I had a really great time exploring this because this features so many different poets, and I've really enjoyed exploring Red Room poetry as well. So I had a great time with that. And then we move into some non-fiction, and there is such a plethora of really great non-fiction out there. I don't have physical copies of as many of them as I would probably like, but these are just some ones that I could pull off the shelf and I can talk about to you. I'm going to be really cheeky. I'm going to include a book here that doesn't come out until February, but highly recommend you check it out when you do, and there'll be a review on Kidlit Joy for this book around February 4th. And that is Caution, this book contains deadly reptiles by Koori with art by Ben Williams. This book is a really fantastic nonfiction book about native reptiles and the country on which they live. What I loved about this so much was that Koori has done a lot of research with local community groups to learn as many of the traditional names for these animals as possible. So not only do we have the English name, but we also have the traditional name of the animal, and I think that's really amazing considering that we have lost so much information about First Nations languages, because there were over 150 plus distinct Indigenous languages. Many of them are sleeping or have been permanently lost because there's no one left alive who speaks them. So to just be able to start recapturing some of that information in books. This was written for kids, but is so engaging and interesting that I would recommend it to anyone who is just interested in Australian animals. Also by Koori, who is doing some amazing work in non-fiction books on First Nations history for kids, but also for a wider audience, is this book, Thinks You're Deadly. This one is a celebration of Black excellence across a variety of fields. It is broken down into lots of different sections, from music, film and television, journalism, literature, education, science, health, sport, etc. And in each section we get a lovely header, and then we get little biographies of people who have done amazing things within that particular field. I love it because you have this amazing portrait done by Holly Hunt, and then you also have a one-page biography. This makes it great for using with kids, but just as someone who lives in this country, to read about all the amazing First Nations people who have gone on to do incredible things. Koori also has another book that is very similar to this called The First Scientists, which includes so much information on First Nations scientific history and the incredible things that First Nations culture can teach us about science. I can't find my copy of the book. I think it's in the classroom, but this is what it looks like. Another one that I read really recently was Always Was, Always Will Be by Auntie Faye Muir and Sue Lawson. And this one is looking at First Nations activism within Australia and the history of it, how it has grown and evolved over time. I learned so much from this book. Again, like I said at the start of this video, we didn't get taught these things in school, so I'm constantly piecing together things as I'm learning them or as I'm hearing bits and pieces and then going and investigating more. But this literally goes through the entire history of First Nations activism, and I can highly recommend this to anyone because I think it is a fantastic read. Also a very important read. 3 more and then we'll get into my TBR because this video is getting long. There is Growing Up Wiradjuri, Stories from the Wiradjuri Nation. This one is edited by Dr. Anita Heiss. So this is stories of First Nations people who've grown up on Wiradjuri country, which is in what is now known as New South Wales. Really great little collection for anyone who's interested in individual people's stories. There is Stan Grant's Talking to My Country, although Stan Grant has a plethora of books now and he's highly worth reading. His work is amazing. And this is Stan Grant reflecting on the impact of race, identity and history. It's a really powerful read. All of his work is. I need to go back. In fact, one of his books is on my TBR, so you're going to hear about that in a minute. His work is just phenomenal and he is very well spoken on all of these topics. Highly recommend this. And then another one that I think is worth checking out for everyone is Growing Up Aboriginal in Australia, which are personal stories of First Nations people from around the country talking about their experiences growing up Aboriginal in Australia, and it is hard-hitting at times, it is confronting at times, but it is an incredible collection. I don't even know how many books that is that I've recommended, but hopefully there is something that you're interested in picking up. I currently have 4 physical books on my TBR by First Nations authors that I would like to try and pick up and read around the 26th of January. I also have a couple of things on hold through Libby, so I'm just waiting for them to come in. I don't know if I'll get them around that time. These are the ones that are on my immediate radar for that particular day. There is a recent acquisition, Garumah Gathering by Janine Lean. This is a poetry collection, or poetry and potentially essays there might be in here. She was the editor for one of the poetry collections, but I found this when I went to the Amplify bookstore and I'm really excited to pick this up. There is Kimberly Kicker's Jai Goes for Gold by Carl Merrison and Hakea Hustler with Jai Farrar, and this one has been illustrated by Samantha Campbell. This is a middle fiction story. I've had it for a while. I've been meaning to pick it up. I always enjoy Carl Merrison and Hakea Hustler's work. I talked about some of their books earlier, but I also have a lot of Carl Merrison's picture books as well. So again, very excited to dive into that. There is Always Was, Always Will Be by Thomas Mayo. This one came after the latest referendum where we were voting for a First Nations voice and the country overwhelmingly voted for no, which I have thoughts and feelings on. But this is a book that came after that and it kind of looks at the question of, well, what next? What do we do next? And it's been written for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous folk who are looking to close the gap. So I really want to get into that one as soon as possible. And then, as I said, I had another Stan Grant book. This is his new one, Murrayang's Song of Time. I don't know all that much about it. I just know it's a new Stan Grant book and I would like to read it. So this is sort of what you can expect to see me reading and hear me talking about in the coming days. In the comments below, I'd love to know if you've read any of these books, if you're planning on picking any of them up, or if you have other favourite Australian First Nations books or authors that you would like to recommend to me or to other people who visit my channel. Please, please, please feel free to leave them down in the comments, because that's how we find new books. If you just want to let me know that you're here but you don't want to leave a comment, feel free to leave the black, the yellow and the red heart emoji down below. Otherwise, I hope that wherever you're in the world, you're staying safe and healthy, and I will see you in my next video. Thanks so much for watching. Bye everyone.